today with regenerative agriculture entrepreneur, researcher, and archaeologist, Everest.
I want to circle back to that because that's really sort of the essence of what my work is, and unpacking that similarities and analogies between that period and the period that we're going into right now, which for someone who works on both sides of this, both sides of this area of study, climate, both in the modern period and in the ancient period, it's becoming increasingly clear that there are very, very fundamental analogies and similarities between this period, 12,000 years ago, when we're making a transition between foraging and farming, and the period that we're going through right now, which is the end of the Holocene. And we're also undergoing massive transitions to our food system, in many ways some of the biggest that humans have ever made. Well, if we keep looking at this broad view, the Holocene is ending, and we are now, for the second time in human history, entering a period of major climatic shift. And this is what we call the Anthropocene. But there's very solid evidence that we're approaching a climatic shift that's of the same magnitude as the one that occurred between the Pleistocene and the Holocene. That's not necessarily a doomsday scenario, but it does mean that there's only one analog to look at in human history if we want to be able to draw something out of the past. So essentially what my work is about is examining these two things, juxtaposing them. What's different? Just as importantly, what's the same? What can we pull out of this that's going to give us more foresight about how we make this transition? How can it give us perspective when ordinarily we're forced to make decisions about very long-term problems that greatly transcend our generation from the perspective of a single human lifespan, which is inherently flawed. But what I'm saying is, go find a historical analogy and crunch the numbers yourself. I suppose that's what I'm saying. I think go find an area that seems analogous to you, and don't necessarily dismiss it because it's extremely different, because a lot of the times the differences are just as important as the similarities between the period. If you invest in soil, you are investing in the only thing that's going to give you a return when the figurative construct that is the world economy once again realizes that it is literally tied to natural resources. And in terms of the inevitability of regeneration, let's look at past analogs. Many, I would even hazard to say, most of the famous civilizations of the Fertile Crescent foundered on agricultural issues. The ancient Assyrians were the first to create really, really large irrigation systems. And within about a century, they started having big issues with salinization, right? And their agriculture started to collapse. You can see clearly in the archaeological record as farmers switch from the crops that they prefer and are most culturally and economically valuable towards lower value crops that can tolerate the salt. And you can see this playing out within, the archaeological sediment. And then at some point, it just becomes too salty and your economy becomes very unstable. And then that's usually when an invasion happens or a war sweeps through or civil unrest, something like that. A lot of these things are precipitated by agriculture, and partly by climate problems, but also just partly because agriculture, when it's done wrong, comes back to bite you within several centuries. And that's just sort of the way it happens.